Yeah, hi, this is Hermes Fernandez again from Schoeneck King. Um, there were quite a few questions during today's webinar regarding the travel advisory and regarding face masks. And I'm going to try to quickly, in 2 minutes, clear up confusion about one or both of those topics. And I think a lot of the confusion comes because we get quite a few questions about, does the requirement apply in this circumstance? So if you start with the face mask requirement or the travel advisory, if someone's coming from a state that's covered by the travel advisory, in both circumstances, the starting point for the decision-making tree is the requirement applies. The face mask requirement applies, right, unless it doesn't, which it's not a very helpful analysis, but it's actually a good starting point. The requirement to wear face masks is a requirement to wear a face mask at all times in public places, which includes places of business, unless social distancing can be maintained. So, if you are in your office by yourself, you don't have to wear a face mask. If you're in your office by yourself and people come in and out of your office and they are less than 6 feet away, a mask is required. So if you are likely to be unable to keep the 6 foot distance, and that is literally the standard that's written in the various guidance and in the regulations, you should be wearing a face mask. If you're a runner and you run, miles a day by yourself or with other people in your household, no mask. If you're a runner and you run with a club of people who are not in your household and you're running elbow to elbow, as I often see people on the road, a mask is required. The exceptions are if an individual is less than 2 years old, or if the individual cannot wear a mask because of their job and their job prevents them from wearing a mask. If you are in a restaurant eating or drinking, obviously you can't perform those activities with a mask on. The mask comes off. But the starting point is a mask is required. A mask can be the paper, those blue paper masks that we see. A mask can be cloth. A mask can be a bandana. A mask can be those clear plastic face shields. All of those fit within the definition of masks. Now, horses for courses. You shouldn't be wearing those plastic face shields, except in certain circumstances because they just don't work as well. I know I wear mostly the paper mask, but the paper masks don't work as well. People can debate whether the mask requirement makes sense or not, but essentially the decision's been made above our grade level. The masks are required. So travel advisory. Let's look at the travel advisories from the same perspective. If you are coming from one of the states that's now covered, and it's up to 22, and I saw some questions as to whether Delaware was dropped from the list. Delaware is still on the list that's posted on the governor's website. If there was an announcement this morning that Delaware is coming off the list, I haven't seen it, but the list is fluid, so it may be coming off. If you're coming from one of those states and you've spent time in those states, and the time that's spent in the states, it's real time. It's not you're sitting in an airport on a waiting for a change of planes. It's not that you've driven across 95, so you've driven from Washington to New York and you've driven through Delaware on 95. That drive time in Delaware, even if you stopped at the rest area to take advantage of the fact that Delaware doesn't have sales tax, that time doesn't count. But you've gone to Florida, you visited your parents in Florida, you went with your family to North Carolina, you went to the Poconos, right? That counts. You're in a state, and I shouldn't have said the Poconos because Pennsylvania is not yet on the list. But you're in one of these states. You've gone into, as I said, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, California. You're coming to New York. Even if you're coming to New York for your job, you are expected to now complete a form, identify for the public health authorities where you're going to stay while you're in New York, and quarantine for 14 days. Right? This quarantine for 14 days is a requirement that's coming up in a lot of different instances. Right? The quarantine for 14 days comes up when there's been an exposure to COVID-19 or to someone with symptoms and you expect they have COVID-19. So this is, again, the same requirement, 14-day requirement, because if you've been in one of those states, there is now a presumption that you've been exposed. And when you've been in one of those states, when you return to New York, you are expected to take a COVID-19 test and you're expected to quarantine for 14 days. We talked about essential employees. Even if you're an essential employee, while you may be able to go back to work in the workplace as an essential employee, you are expected to maintain quarantine when you are not at work. So that requirement is there for everyone. There are different conditions, but the requirement is there. And the requirement is there because the incubation period for COVID-19 is expected to be 2 to 14 days from exposure. So that's where the 14 days comes from. Most people would actually become positive within 2 to 5 days, but the standard is up to 14 days. So wear face masks whenever you're in public, whenever you expect you're unable to maintain social distancing, and be liberal about making the interpretation that you were likely to, as to whether you were likely to maintain social distancing. If you travel to one of the covered states, start from the presumption that you are going to be required to take a test when you come to New York. You're going to be required to notify public health authorities where you're going to stay while you're in New York, and you are required to quarantine for 14 days unless you fall within an exception. If you've got particular circumstances you'd like to discuss with me or any of the other lawyers at Bond, Schoeneck King, we're happy to take your calls and your emails, but those are the starting points. Thanks for listening.